Welcome back to the Context Channel, where we cut through the headlines to deliver the crucial analysis. I'm your host, Emily, and today we are diving deep into a diplomatic earthquake surrounding the Russia Ukraine war. The news this week has been dominated by reports of a secret US Russia peace framework, a 28-point proposal that has ignited fury from Kyiv to Brussels. This isn't just about ending a war, it's about redrawing the lines of global power and, critically, the future of European security. With me today to break down the sheer geopolitical and economic stakes of this crisis is Richard, our expert in geopolitics and economic warfare. Richard, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Emily. It's an incredibly tense time. The diplomatic moves we are seeing right now are more disruptive than almost any single action on the battlefield. This proposal isn't just a threat to Ukraine's sovereignty, it's a foundational challenge to the entire Western alliance's strategy against economic aggression and military conquest.
Absolutely. The reports coming from outlets like Axios, Financial Times, and The Telegraph reveal a plan that would, require Ukraine to basically sacrifice significant parts of its security, like handing over territory in the eastern Donbass region and even imposing a 50% cut on its
Mm.
armed forces.
And let's not forget, these conditions come at a time when the conflict is still raging, missile strikes are intensifying, and a brutal attack in Ternopil left at least 26 people dead. Really, it's a recipe for alarm.
Right, because at the very moment when the war is showing its full, brutal intensity, there's this reported draft suggesting a diplomatic off ramp that demands heavy concessions from Ukraine.
Exactly. But here's something I find really intriguing, the idea that Ukraine was essentially excluded from the drafting process. What do you think about that?
Well, that's the kicker, isn't it? Ukraine, a direct victim of the aggression, isn't really sitting at the table as an equal partner. Instead, the negotiations seem to be taking place in a back room between US officials and, Russian figures, which immediately explains why both Kiev and Europe reacted with such anger.
Yep. It does sound like a classic case of, negotiating terms that are preset, which is why so many are calling it capitulation. And have you heard about the so-called renting of the Donbass region?
Yes, and that's one of the more unusual details in the plan. The idea is that Ukraine would retain legal ownership on paper, but Russia could essentially rent the
Mm.
territory.
Renting war-torn territory isn't like a standard diplomatic tool at all. It's almost as if it's a cynical workaround, allowing Russia de facto control while avoiding overt annexation, right?
Exactly. It's like saying, we'll let you run the show for now, but on paper, it still belongs to Ukraine, which is a clear attempt to sidestep international outcry.
True. And then there's the military aspect, this 50% troop reduction. I mean, cutting your forces in half during an active conflict, that's a hard pill to swallow.
Absolutely. It's tantamount to kneecapping Ukraine. Reducing your armed forces by 50% would severely limit Ukraine's ability to defend itself if hostilities were to flare up again, especially given that Russia's own demands have always been for a permanently neutral and demilitarized Ukraine.
Right. Yeah, and this isn't the first time we've seen such demands, is it? I recall similar maximalist terms being pushed during the Istanbul talks back in 2022.
Exactly. Analysts, like those at the Institute for the Study of War, are drawing straight lines between these so called new concessions and Russia's earlier maximalist demands. They even said this deal sounds more like a repackaged version of Russia's victory document from
Hmm.
Istanbul.
Now let's talk a bit about the financial lever in this whole drama, the frozen Russian assets, right? There's talk of a $140 billion loan for Ukraine that hinges on these assets. That's massive.
Right. And here's where the stakes get even higher. Europe's been trying to harness those frozen assets through Euroclear, which holds about two-thirds of that wealth, to secure a huge reparations loan for Ukraine. But there's a catch. The legal risks for Euroclear
Yep.
are considerable.
Exactly. So Belgium, where Euroclear is based, finds itself in a tricky spot. They need an indemnity, an ironclad legal guarantee from the EU to ensure they're not left holding the bag if Russia decides to retaliate with lawsuits.
It's like a financial game of chicken. Russia's parliament even voted to authorize legal action against Belgium and Euroclear if their assets were used or confiscated.
Mm. Which makes you wonder if the reported 28-point peace plan is really a genuine attempt at ending the conflict or just a desperate maneuver to stave off the financial catastrophe that Russia might face.
Absolutely. Some voices, like EU Foreign Policy Chief Kajakhalis, suggest that Russia's sudden push for this plan is driven by financial desperation, essentially, a way to avoid losing that massive revenue from Russian
Right.
assets.
Now, on the US side, it's interesting how they're framing this. They're suggesting that the concessions, as painful as they are for Ukraine, are necessary for a durable peace. But how do you reconcile that when US military officials are also in Kyiv assessing real battlefield needs?
That's the contradiction that's been puzzling everyone. On one hand, the US is insisting that for peace to be achieved, both sides must make hard concessions. On the other hand, their ongoing military presence in Kiev indicates that they're fully aware of Ukraine's immediate need for defense.
Mm. And that sends a mixed message to Ukraine. How can you be assured that the peace plan isn't just a way to seasonally cut military support rather than really ending the conflict?
Exactly, it's a delicate balance. Ukraine is in a position where it desperately needs the military aid coming in from the West, yet it's also being presented with this deal that fundamentally weakens its defensive capabilities.
Right. And let's not forget the diplomatic maneuvering behind the scenes. The plan was reportedly backed by President Trump and his envoy, Steve Witkoff, working directly with a Kremlin advisor, Karol Dmitriev, who, by the way, is under US sanctions that had to be specifically waived. That alone speaks volumes about how high up the political stakes are.
Yeah, it's definitely not a low level back channel operation. These are senior figures with major political capital and significant legal and diplomatic implications.
Mm. Now, here's a point I want to respectfully challenge. Some argue that these concessions might actually pave the way for a lasting peace if, say, temporary structures are built, kind of like the ceasefire model seen in the Gaza Agreement. Do you really buy that given the context?
Well, I get the rationale behind drawing a parallel to the Gaza managed conflict model. But here's the thing, a temporary ceasefire without a final resolution on key issues like sovereignty and borders is a dangerous half solution. It risks just freezing the conflict in place rather than resolving it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Exactly. And it circles back to the larger issue. Any peace deal that significantly weakens Ukraine militarily, even temporarily, could leave the door open for future aggression by Russia.
Precisely. And that's why European leaders are vehemently rejecting such terms. We've seen strong responses from EU figures like French and German ministers, clearly stating that peace must not come at the cost of capitulation.
Right. And Poland's foreign minister, Sikorski, is particularly adamant that the concessions should be imposed on the aggressor, not the victim. For Europe, Ukraine's security is literally tied to their own.
Exactly. The European reaction has been nearly unanimous in saying that any agreement must involve both Ukrainians and Europeans equally, and that must include a balance where Russia isn't rewarded with control or territorial gains.
Mm. And then there's Hungary, which stands out with its dissenting view, arguing against supporting Ukraine. That in itself provides Russia with a sort of political ammunition to claim that Europe is fractured.
Right. Hungary's perspective, while not shared by most of the EU, is enough to complicate the message Russia is trying to push. It gives them, a way to argue that the West isn't unified on Ukraine's support.
Yeah, that's a major factor. So, overall, what does this duality, the need for immediate military support and the push for a potentially self-harming diplomatic settlement, mean for Ukraine going forward?
It means that Ukraine is caught in an incredibly tough spot. On one side, there's the urgent need for military backing and security guarantees. On the other, there's the pressure to agree to terms that might compromise its long term sovereignty and defense capability.
Mm. And with the financial dimension, the frozen assets, and the potential $140 billion loan, everything just becomes even more convoluted, right?
Exactly. The financial side is like the icing on an already volatile cake. Russia's push for these measures is driven by its dire need to safeguard its economic interests as sanctions take their toll. If the EU goes ahead with tapping those assets, that will clearly be seen as a direct financial threat by Moscow.
I agree. And interestingly enough, these dynamics feed right back into the military domain. The more financial pressure Russia faces, the more likely it is to double down on its aggressive posture, unless, of course, it sees a viable diplomatic path forward.
Right. Which brings us back to the critical, unresolved question: how long can Russia, and by extension the West, maintain this delicate balancing act without tipping the scales towards either renewed full scale conflict or a permanent, unstable ceasefire?
Mm. It's a chess game with global stakes, and every move is laden with risk. And with US Secretary of State Marco Rubio framing these concessions as difficult but necessary, it suggests the pressure is mounting on all sides.
Yeah, it's like a high pressure dinner party where the host keeps insisting that everyone must compromise, even when one of the guests is being left with the short end of the stick.
Exactly. And in this case, the guest is Ukraine. With its sovereignty, military strength, and future security hanging in the balance, the stakes couldn't be higher.
Absolutely. The coming months will be crucial as these diplomatic and military moves unfold. For now, we're left with a plan that's as controversial as it is consequential. A plan that forces us to question: can peace really be brokered at such a high cost?
Right on.